Let me first introduce the members of the panel, starting with Chad Emmit, who is a geography professor. He received his PhD from the University of Chicago in 1991. Sitting next to him is Lynn England. Lynn received his PhD from the University of Pittsburgh in 1971 in sociology. Jim Curl received his PhD in economics from MIT in 1975. And Ted Lyon received his PhD from UCLA in 1967. I'm Ralph Brown. I received my PhD at the University of Missouri-Columbia in rural sociology in 1992. Here's what I'd like to do as a moderator. Each one of the panelists has been asked to address a specific topic. Chad Emmit specifically dealing with terrorism and the Arab-Israeli conflict, Jim Curl with outsourcing, Ted Lyon immigration, and Lynn England the environment. What I've done is taken a few comments from the candidates off from the transcripts of the 4 debates, the 3 presidential debates, the 1 vice presidential debate. And I'm going to start with Chad, and I'm going to read a couple of comments from the various candidates. And then we're going to have them talk, each panelist, for about 3 to 4 minutes. And then we'll open it up across the panel to discuss further that specific topic, and then open it up to you to ask questions specifically on that topic. We have 4 topics that we want to cover. We're going to probably have about 40 minutes to cover it at best, so we'll have 10 minutes per topic. It's going to be tight, okay? First off, this morning in the New York Times, there was an op-ed piece by Thomas Friedman. Let me read a little piece from that. It says, "Politicizing 9/11 put a wedge between us and our history. The Bush team has turned this country into the United States of fighting terrorism. Bush only seems able to express our anger, not our hopes," said the Mideast expert Stephen Cohen. "His whole focus is on an America whose role in the world is to negate the negation of the terrorists. But America has always been about the affirmation of something positive. This is missing today. Beyond Afghanistan, they've been much better at destruction than construction." Interesting piece from Thomas Friedman. Again, a new op-ed piece this morning. Much of the debates have obviously centered on terrorism, particularly with the war in Iraq and its link or lack thereof to terrorism. One of the issues that has not been covered as closely, however, is the issue of the Palestinian-Israeli debate or conflict. Where it was covered the most, ironically, was in the vice presidential debate. Let me read a couple of pieces from Edwards' response and then Cheney's, and I'm going to turn it over to Chad. Eiffel asked Senator Edwards, as we wrap up the foreign policy, part of this debate, "I want you to talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict." Let me read just a couple of pieces. It says, "First, the Israeli people not only have the right to defend themselves, they should defend themselves. They have an obligation to defend themselves. What are the Israeli people supposed to do? How can they continue to watch Israeli children killed by suicide bombers, killed by terrorists? Israel has a right to defend itself. They don't have a partner for peace right now. They certainly don't have a partner in Arafat." Cheney also, "First president ever, Bush is the first president ever to say we'll establish and support a Palestinian state next door to Israel. But first, there has to be someone you can trust and deal with. We won't have that, and we don't have it now in Yasser Arafat." Chad?
I'd like to begin by reading from a statement issued by Osama bin Laden the 8th of October 2001, a month after the September 11th bombings. This is in the New York Times, and it was broadcast on Al Jazeera. In it, he talks about, the title is "The Sword Fell," and it's kind of his justification of why the Al-Qaeda attacked the United States. And he talks about, he says, "1 million innocent children are dying at this time as we speak, killed in Iraq without any guilt. We hear no denunciation. We hear no edict from the hereditary rulers. In these days, Israel tanks rampage across Palestine, in Ramallah, Rafah, and Beit Jala, and many other parts of the land of Islam, and we do not hear anyone raising his voice or reacting." And then he concludes, "As to America, I say to it and its people a few words. I swear to God that America will not live in peace before peace reigns in Palestine and before all the army of infidels depart the land of Muhammad." And there you get, I think, part of the logic or reasoning behind Al-Qaeda, the frustration with U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia, involved in Islamic countries. But one of the first thing he mentioned was the conflict in Palestine and the lack of a Palestinian state, and his opposition to Israel. And he made that statement, and I kept hoping and waiting for the Bush administration to address some of these challenges of al-Qaeda. And the war on terror started out going after al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, and I think that was a good thing. And at one point in April of 2002, President Bush did urge, he says, all parties must realize that the only long-term solution is for two states, Israel and Palestine, to live side by side in security and peace. So the Bush administration briefly acknowledged that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was one of the core reasons, or one of the basic reasons for terrorist attacks against the United States, al-Qaeda's frustration with the United States. And yet, it was acknowledged by the Bush administration, but I haven't seen much action. The Bush administration did propose a roadmap to peace, which was well thought out and had potential, and yet the problem is that roadmap never really got off the ground. And I think the reason being is that most U.S. administrations allow Israel to go at it on their own. Will propose, will suggest, but Israel, and I guess they have the right to, as a sovereign nation, they basically decide, no, we're not going to do that. And so the roadmap never really got off the ground, and part of the reason is the Bush administration refuses to deal with Arafat as the democratically elected president of the Palestinian people. They've tried to circumvent him by working with prime ministers, and if they don't like one prime minister, then they try to get a new prime minister put in place. And so we've really backed off on the Bush administration, in my opinion, really backed off on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and has allowed Ariel Sharon to create his own roadmap, which is to withdraw from the Gaza Strip unilaterally and to not really deal with the West Bank. The Kerry, if you go to the Kerry webpage, there's nothing there. He talks a lot about the war on terrorism, but nothing is mentioned about how to, the roots of terror. It's, we can promote democracy, we can promote education, we can, build these economies, but they don't really address the Arab-Israeli conflict, which then brings me to the third candidate, Ralph Nader, who, if I were voting on a single issue, I think he is the only candidate who actually recognizes that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict needs to be resolved before there will be peace. And we need to focus on that. And I've got quotes here from him, but he says it is time for the Washington puppet show to be replaced by the Washington Peace Show. In that, we will enhance the freedom and security of both Palestinian and Israeli peoples around the world, and American people here and abroad. But it's unfortunate, I think, that politicians in the United States do not address the issue of Israeli-Palestinian peace. That's always been the case in election years, where they back off because they don't want to jeopardize constituents who might vote for them. And I think Nader's the only one who dares, he can afford to, I guess, offend people, but he basically says we need to have an Israeli-Palestinian peace if we want to root out terrorism. And then just finally, the Egyptian consul that spoke here on Monday, he said peaceful resolutions to the war in Iraq and the Palestinian issue in Israel would rob terrorist groups of future recruits and stabilize the Middle East. And I think that that's true, and I wish more of the candidates would address that. Thank you.
I'm going to turn the time over to the panel now to pick up anything they want on Chad's comments or anything else on this topic.
I mean, I agree with Chad and disagree in one sense. I mean, it strikes me that the notion that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the breeding ground for terrorism is just wrong, but it's an excuse, and the excuse ought to be done away with. And my criticism of the Bush administration and a prospective Kerry administration is that no one has the guts really to lean on Ariel Sharon, which is where you have to solve this problem. The Israelis, and indeed it's widely understood among the Israeli public, that given their political system, that the only possible way out of this is for very substantial pressure from the United States on the Israeli government to solve this problem. I do not think it solves the terrorism problem, but it gets rid of an excuse. And we ought to get rid of the excuses so that we see it nakedly for what it is. But the focus on Arafat is misplaced in my view. The focus ought to be on Ariel Sharon and on the Likud party and on pushing Israel toward a recognition that they have to get out of the West Bank.
I agree. I think it's not the cause of terrorism, but in many ways it's an excuse. And to have a two-state solution requires Israel to cooperate and Ariel Sharon to do more than just pull out of Gaza. And then the war on terror is a multi-front battle, and I think too often we hear Iraq as that's the war on terror, and yet that's just one small part of it, and we need to get at all the root causes of terrorism. And part of that is for the United States to be perceived as a fair partner in the Middle East that's willing to treat all peoples as equal and work towards peace and in the region. And until we do that, I think Arabs and Muslims around the world will not really accept us as truly interested in them and in peace. And so I think that's one part of it, but it's not the only part. But it is a crucial part that I think is missing from much of the current debate. It's not really there. If you go to the debate transcripts, it's hard to find anything about the conflict at all.
I want to open it up to questions from the audience. Sure, go ahead. Back in the back.
We talked about Ariel Sharon getting out, all this stuff. Both of you mentioned that. And Israel wasn't getting Gaza and the West Bank until March of 2002 when there were bombings on Passover and stuff like that. This was after 9/11, after the transcript, after all some of the statement.
But by the way, that's simply not true. Israel has had settlements in Gaza and the West Bank since 1967.
Yeah, they've had the settlements, but
But they are in the West Bank, so it is simply not true not to say Israel isn't in the West Bank.
okay, let me rephrase that. They've been in the West Bank. What I mean is that the oppression, the things that we see now in the news, they weren't happening. Israeli tanks were not rolling through the streets in the West Bank of Gaza.
Israeli settlers were taking land.
Well, that's kind of a general statement.
No, it's not. It's a specific statement. They were taking land from Palestinians. That's as deep as you need to go. That's there's no depth to this. The problem here is the confiscation of land on the West Bank and Gaza Strip.
Okay, let me rephrase the question.
Thank you.
Barack was the president, Barack was the prime minister. He was in a very non-confrontational mode, right? He wanted to work out a deal. Okay, and even Sharon, after it came in, was exercising great restraint in dealing with a lot of the attacks that were happening. And then, because of the continued pressure that was put on Sharon because of the attacks, which were, instigated by Arafat, the reoccupation, the repression began again. So how can you say then that Arafat isn't the problem? How can you say that, Arafat should be negotiated?
The problem goes back decades, and this has been going on, the settlements, the taking of land, the destroying of homes, the closures. I mean, it's not just the last 2 years, and it has been going on. And so Ariel Sharon now is backing off from what was kind of the Oslo Peace Accord. The negotiations at Camp David was a two-state solution, Israel at one point withdrawing from Palestinian territories, and now Sharon is backing off from that. He's saying we'll pull out of Gaza. Meanwhile, we'll still build settlements in the West Bank. And so the Palestinians, the Arab world, are seeing that these settlements are still going up. Israel is still not committed to a Palestinian state. And there's frustration. The wall's going up, encroaching on more Palestinian territory. The Palestinians have no hope. There's nothing that gives them any hope for a future state. And it's mainly Israel's intransigence that is causing that.
I need to cut this off. I knew this was going to happen.
I want to say one other thing,
All right,
which
really
is
fast, Jim.
I'm not a fan of Arafat. Arafat is a corrupt, stupid man. He had an opportunity on 2 different occasions to secure a deal and passed. So he doesn't go without blame on this. He gets no free pass on this matter. But he's been sort of cooped up in a building for 3 years and has nothing to do, frankly. But it is true that Palestinians have missed some golden opportunities, and he's the principal problem there. A pox on both their houses, actually.
Moving on. Thanks for your comments. Next one I want to bring to the panel is the issue of outsourcing. And specifically, Jim Curl is going to talk a bit about that. I want to introduce a couple of things. This is from the third debate, which occurred last night. Bob Schaefer asked, is it fair to blame the administration entirely for the loss of jobs? Kerry's response was, a piece of it anyway, I don't blame them entirely for it. I blame the president for the things the president could do that has had an impact on it. Outsourcing is going to happen. I've acknowledged that in union halls across the country. In the second debate, a similar kind of response. You can't stop outsourcing, Charlie. I've never promised that. I'm not going to because that would be pandering. You can't. You can't stop it. In both cases, President Bush's comments following up, because the 2 questions were directed specifically to Kerry and President Bush had the follow-up, dealt with small business and subchapter S corporations. He said that they just are. Most small businesses, 70% of the new jobs in America are created by small businesses. Taxes are going up when you run up the 2 top brackets. It's a fact. That's a quote from President Bush. The concept of outsourcing was used a variety of different ways. It was talked about in terms of outsourcing the war. It was talked about in terms of outsourcing economics. It was talked about in terms of importing drugs from Canada, so on and so forth. So, Jim, I'm going to turn it over to you at this point.
I have a very short comment. 3 cheers for outsourcing. First point, we've been outsourcing as long as we've been trading. That is, if you buy a Toyota and that Toyota is manufactured in Japan, you outsource the job. So the notion that this is something new is just foolish. It turns out that it's new only because we're outsourcing services, where in the past we've been outsourcing manufacturing. Second point, we insource as much as we outsource, and indeed in the service area we insource a lot more. The rest of the world, if you take sort of criticisms of outsource seriously, the rest of the world ought to be concerned about us. We insource software, consulting, accounting, financial, insurance, education, and if you are foreign students going to BYU, your country is outsourcing professors' jobs to the United States. Third, you ought to be in favor of outsourcing for 2 reasons. 1, because it benefits you as a consumer, and 2, you ought to care about people in India and in the Philippines and other places where these jobs are going. I mean, it is unconscionable for wealthy Americans to say to India, which has finally had an opportunity to see some economic development, stop. We're not going to let you take any jobs that pay better than peasant wages. There are no Benedict Arnold CEOs. This is beyond silly. And a phrase that Mr. Kerry has used a fair amount. CEOs ought to respond to whatever the incentives are. If you think the tax incentives are wrong, then you may want to change the tax incentives, but to label people as Benedict Arnold CEOs is stupid. We ought to expect our CEOs to buy things and to produce things in the cheapest place possible, because that's how you get high quality, low cost things. By the way, I should tell you that the tax code issues are very complex. But at least part of the reason why there are some tax incentives for outsourcing certain kinds of things are, 1, because this is a development initiative of the United States. We tried to provide incentives for firms to go abroad and help develop economies. This is a good thing, not a bad thing. All right? And the fact that they've now done them, we can hardly turn on them. 2, in some sense, it has to do with sort of extraterritoriality, sort of an application of laws. The United States doesn't get to tax incomes generated in India, in the same sense that we'd be furious if the Germans decided they wanted to tax the sale of Mercedes-Benz in the United States. They don't get to do that. So most of this outsourcing has to do with income that's generated by multinational corporations that happens to occur because wholly owned subsidiaries are located abroad. We don't get to tax that. I should say, since this may appear to be an anti-Kerry tirade, it's not. Bush doesn't get this either. His response to this is, we've got to educate our workforce better and make them more productive. Well, sure we do, because that will raise incomes in the United States, but it will not protect jobs from outsourcing. Jobs from outsourcing has to do with relative prices and not absolute levels of productivity. And so it's a good thing to have a productive labor force, but will not keep us from losing some jobs abroad. We lose jobs abroad because others can produce things relatively cheaper than we can. Finally, Mr. Bush has led an administration that is tepid with relationship to more open and freer trade. The infamous steel tariffs, which were politically convenient, suggest that he has no deep commitment to open trade. The agricultural bill that he signed 2 years ago, which is $180 billion in subsidies over the next 10 years, most of the subsidized goods will be dumped in world markets, impoverishing people in Botswana who are trying to produce cotton and sell it in the world market, and we are killing them by dumping sugar, cotton, and other products abroad. He didn't veto that, and he's made no effort to undo an insidious amendment called the Byrd Amendment, which provides an incentive for firms to actually try to block imports because they then get rewarded by the tariff that is imposed by the U.S. government. Instead of the tariff revenue going to the U.S. government, the tariff revenue under the Byrd Amendment, under special circumstances, now goes to private corporations, providing an incentive, an endless incentive for mischief.
Again, directed to the panel. Anybody want to respond? Come on. Looks like, audience, it's yours.
Dr. Curl spoke about how President Bush and other presidents haven't vetoed bills that because on agriculture specifically, perhaps because they're worried about their political careers. With the power of the sugar lobbyists that we've spoken about before, how do you propose a politician in Mr. Bush's or Mr. Kerry's position abolish agriculture subsidies and other things like that without putting their political careers on the line?
Jim, before you answer that, would you restate the question in the microphone so that those outside know
The
what
question is, Mr. Bush, I'll paraphrase the question, which is Mr. Bush didn't veto the ag bill because he couldn't afford to politically. Well, I mean, we elect presidents whom we hope have guts at some point. I mean, if they're sort of driven by every political whim, which these two guys are, then we can't hope to have anything different. But I think the broad agreement is that the agricultural price support bill is among the most insidious and sort of worst pieces of U.S. legislation in the last 5 years. It doesn't just, it hurts you because it increases your costs, but had the United States localized this, that is, if the United States wants to have high prices for food, it can do that. All it has to do is buy and store in the United States. But this is a bill that says we will support prices in the United States, but we will not permit the U.S. government to store. Instead, the U.S. government will dump in foreign markets agricultural products, thereby depressing prices throughout the world. In that case, there's no particular constituency for that. So even if you wanted $180 billion in subsidies, you didn't have to have a provision that drives down the price of cotton in Botswana or drives down the price of sugar throughout the Caribbean. I mean, we are harming people by maintaining prices higher here and then sort of dumping goods on the world market.
Time for one other question, if somebody would like to ask it. Yes, please.
I've heard that Senator Kerry wants to make free trade with other nations contingent upon things like their compliance with environmental standards and things like that. What do you think of that, Dr. Curl?
Question is, Mr. Kerry wants to make free trade contingent on environmental and labor standards. Well, it's not free trade if you make it contingent on those things. That's the first point. The second point is this is just protectionism in another guise. This is an effort to drive up costs abroad so foreigners can compete. The third point is it is U.S. imperialism at its worst to tell countries we'll dictate to you what your environmental and labor laws ought to be. And fourth, if you care about sweatshops and about polluted environments around the world, the best solution for that is economic growth. All right? Their evidence is overwhelming that as countries become wealthier, they provide better work environments and cleaner environments. So the issue here is how do we promote economic growth so that countries can afford this? And sure, there's a lot of sweatshops, and there's a lot of child labor, and there's a lot of pollution, and this is a deplorable thing. The question is, are we better off by not trading and therefore impoverishing those countries, or by trading and offering them an opportunity to increase per capita income and therefore opt for a different set of domestic policies? My view is that we ought to foster trade.
Thanks. Moving on to the issue of immigration. In last night's debate, Bob Schaefer said the following: I got more emails this week on this question than any other question. Interesting, however, even given that response, it had probably the least amount of attention given to it in the debate. And it's about immigration. I'm told that at least 8,000 people cross our borders illegally every day. Some people believe this is a security issue, as you know. Some believe it's an economic issue. Some see it as a human rights issue. This question was addressed to President Bush. How do you see it, and what do we need to do about it? President Bush said, I see it as a serious problem. I see it as a security issue. I see it as an economic issue, and I see it as a human rights issue. And he went on to outline a couple of things. I'll identify what some of those were. More border patrol, temporary worker cards so that people can come into the United States with a card, legally work for a period of time, and return back. But he also emphasized that he would not support an amnesty program. When Kerry's turn for rebuttal came, he said, number one, the borders are more leaky today than they were before 9/11. The fact is we haven't done what we need to do to toughen up our borders, and I will. Secondly, we need a guest worker program, but if that's all we have, it's not going to solve the problem. He then also agreed that he would have the worker program, but he said the following: he would crack down on illegal hiring in the United States, people who hired illegal immigrants. And then he also said he would have an earned legalization program, also known as an amnesty program, for people who have been here for a long time, stayed out of trouble, got a job, paid their taxes, and their kids are American.
I'm noting a little pattern between the three of us so far. I wish we could simply say there is a specific policy, there is a specific thing that we could tell you about, and this is put in place. But in most cases, we're dealing with laws that have been passed and things that may not have worked. And specifically with respect to immigration, two or three things related to that. I can't say one is black and one is white, Kerry or Bush. They're very close. When Bush was running for president 4 years ago, his idea was close the borders, make it harder for illegals to come across the border. Various acts were put in place or talked about anyway, and especially an act from the 1980s that employers would be punished for hiring illegal aliens. During the year 2003, last year, 4 employers in the United States have been taken to court for hiring illegal aliens. Do you think more than 4 employers have hired illegal aliens? Here we have something that is simply not being followed, and the Bush administration has chosen to not make that an issue. Quite to the contrary to the issues here, Bush's recent statements have indicated to us that if a foreign worker comes to the United States and a North American worker doesn't want to take that job, then that foreign worker should be able to work and function in the society and then be recognized as a citizen in the society over a period of time. But I fault both Kerry and Bush on the following. They've made immigration a political issue rather than the human issue that I think it ought to be. And what do I mean by that? They are talking only about immigration of Latinos to the United States, and especially coming from Mexico, almost exclusively Mexico. Immigration is so much broader a topic, but they've used it as they've talked throughout the Southwest or the Sun Belt about problems of people coming to the United States who want to work and not making it the broader issue of immigration. Let me mention a couple of problems that do need to be addressed. Right now, we have between 700,000 and 1 million foreigners coming to the United States on permanent visas to live or work in this country. It was 700,000 the year 2003. It was 1 million the previous year, 2002. That's a good number, but what's happening is we're falling down on that, and despite their intent to speed up immigration process, it's very obvious that last year it was slowed down considerably for that problem. Second problem is that student visas and tourist visas in the United States have dropped about 40% in the last year from the previous year. So similar to permanent residents coming and dropping some 30%, tourist visas have dropped 40%. Many people are concerned that we're not getting the students that we had and tourists, but especially foreign students are having a much more difficult time. And if you've lived abroad, as I have, you found that this is extremely difficult. Even Mormon missionaries in many countries now are being denied visas if their call is to bring them to the United States. They're not getting those visas. So the process has been made more tough, but the border has not been protected, and that is the problem that is Kerry talks about in his policy. We've got to strengthen the border, exactly what Bush was saying 4 years ago. I frankly don't see a big difference in the policies that are projected from these two men.
Thank you. Panel members?
One of the things that disturbs me most about the whole talk about immigration, first of all, I think as Ted was suggesting, we act as if all immigration were somehow illegal and ignore the amount of legal and documented immigration that takes place. But the other feature of this, we're not asking ourselves, the candidates in particular are not asking themselves, why? What are the incentives for example, the people who do enter the United States illegally? Why do they do that? And why do we not prosecute employers when it's illegal to employ the undocumented workers? And I hate to do this, but it's an admission to Jim of something. There is a market for that kind of labor in the United States. And there are economic incentives for people to come into the United States illegally, even though they may run very high risks. And there's no inclination on the part of either of the candidates to talk about the underlying root problem rather than simply talking about this as either a terrorist issue or as a question of needing to somehow isolate ourselves from these devious people who want to come into the United States and take our jobs away. And the whole discourse is very disturbing to me.
Thank you very much. I don't know that I need to respond to that other than to say immigration is not a big policy. We just heard about it last night really for the first time in the debates. So the elections are certainly not going to hang on immigration, but it does need to get serious. One article I read says we had 33 million people coming into the United States in the decade 1990 to the year 2000. Those are people who were legal immigrants to the United States. Maybe we ought to be concerned about the fact that now 12 to 13% of the population of the United States is foreign-born. These things, the issues aren't being addressed. That's all I would say. All you need to do living in Utah County is recognize who installs your carpet, who sells food to you when you go to McDonald's or other places. We're dealing with many, many, many immigrants, and some of them illegal immigrants. I'm certainly not in favor of saying no more illegal immigrants. We've been born, we grew as a country on this matter, but the policies are not being addressed, and there are acts in Congress right now, a DREAM Act, for example, to assist education, where students who are children of illegal immigrants can have a privilege to go to college and so on. It's called the DREAM Act if they behave themselves during high school. A lot of things pending, but acts that exist, since I said, since the Reagan era in 1986, which created an amnesty and then put a supposed very strong penalty on employers, but it's not even being followed. We have laws, but they're not being carried out.
I of course think all things are economic. There is political immigration, but it's for the most part trivial. The immigration, legal or otherwise, is being driven primarily by economics. If we think of this as an issue, and it's there's an open question about whether we do, since almost all of us are children of immigrants a few generations back. But if we think of it as an issue in terms of culture and other things, then the long-term policy solution is economic development abroad. And the easiest way for the United States to foster long-term economic development abroad is to trade, so that it creates jobs in Mexico instead of in the United States.
And that is happening. But a couple of days ago in the New York Times, they talked about so many of the immigrants along the border now being out of work because the companies have moved to Mexico, but now they're citizens of the United States and they don't want to return to Mexico. So I won't fight that.
I think given the time, we'll move to the last item, which is on the environment. In the second debate, Charlie Gibson directed, it was a town hall style debate where different people asked questions from the audience. And James Hubb asked a question of President Bush which said following: Mr. President, how would you rate yourself as an environmentalist? What specifically has your administration done to improve the condition of our nation's air and water supply? President Bush then named off a variety of things. I'll give you a quick rundown of those. Off-road diesel engines reduced by 90% their pollution. Plan to increase wetlands by 3 million. Aggressive brownfield program to refurbish inner city sore spots to use useful pieces of property. Clear Skies Initiative, a very strong title in the Farm Bill for the conservation of set-aside land. Healthy Forest Bill. He says, finally, we have a common sense policy. And he talked about using technology as a way to change the way we live, introducing a hydrogen automobile and clean coal technology. Finally, he said, I guess you'd say I'm a good steward of the land. The quality of the air is cleaner since I've been the president, fewer water complaints since I've been the president, more land being restored since I've been the president. Kerry's response was, boy, to listen to that, the president, I don't think boy, to listen to that, the president, I don't think is living in a world of reality with respect to the environment. Now, when it comes to the issue of the environment, this is one of the worst administrations in modern history. He listed different critiques to the ones that the president had identified, then finally ended with this: they pulled out of the global warming, declared it dead, didn't even accept the science. I'm going to be a president who believes in science. Probably this one particular issue divides these two candidates more than any, as well as this population. Lynn, it's yours.
I was surprised that Ralph even found a statement referring to the environment.
Because a citizen had to ask it.
That's right. I think both candidates have made the decision that environmental issues are number one, a political liability, and so it's best not to take a position that's widely known. And the other is that, as with much of the rest of the election, there's a great deal of sloganeering going on with relatively little depth. The other feature to the environmental issues, if you try to become informed, is the very quick entry into technical discussions that are very difficult for most of us to follow. And much of the discussion on both sides is based on a collection of models of pollution and so forth that are probably more politically motivated than scientifically based. And it's interesting to watch the maneuvering where both sides would like to capture science as being on their side and appeal to science where I'm not convinced that either of them understands the science that's involved. President Bush, and again there's a labeling issue, President Bush is in favor of clear skies. Candidate Kerry is in favor of clean skies and clean air. The Clear Skies program that Bush promotes is to be an effort to reduce air pollution, which we're all in favor of. And the idea is that you will set targets. Targets are to be divided between east and west, and that there will then be incentives in place, and you allow the market to work within the incentives to bring pollution within target goals. So they have, for example, set as targets the reduction of emissions of pollutants such as sulfur dioxide and mercury. They're to be reduced by 70%. The market mechanisms, he says, well-established market mechanisms will be the ones that will lead industry to reach those targets rather than relying on direct intervention. The other thing that the President talks a great deal about, at least on his website, is the introduction of an energy program which is closely related to the concerns about the environment. And the main points of the energy program for the President are a reduction of our dependence on foreign energy sources and an improvement of the distribution system for electrical power. Specifically, he would begin to develop the Arctic Wildlife Refuge, oil reserves. Natural gas is to be a major component. There will be an Alaskan natural gas pipeline. He wants to build new refineries as part of the energy program, increased reliance on nuclear power, and the encouragement of alternative fuels that will be promoted by incentives. The CARRY program is basically a program that would return to the Clinton program on the environment. He talks about what are referred to as clean green communities. The idea is that Superfund will be re-emphasized and that there will be an increased cleaning up of contaminated sites. Urban areas will be revitalized through parks and ball fields being developed for every child. The elimination of traffic congestion and sprawl, which is to be done locally but with federal incentives. And then he talks about a conservation covenant that his administration would make with the country, where there's careful evaluation of the impacts of development in remote areas before you allow for the development. You enforce the restoration requirements on mining and other mineral development, and you re-emphasize the protection of roadless areas. He specifically cites the support for ban on snowmobiles in Yellowstone and Grand Teton, re-emphasis of the Endangered Species Act, and the interest in modernizing mining laws, which, if you're not aware of the fact, most of our mining laws date back to the late 1800s. He has a program to deal with global warming, and he also has a program to restore water and water quality. It's to me, again, a frustrating area, largely because it's mainly a matter of sloganeering and very little real attention to the issues.
Panel members?
Yeah, well, let me follow that along. You're saying sloganeering or rhetoric that we hear. Deseret News a few weeks ago ran a series of articles on national parks. The Bush administration affirmed that there was more money being spent per capita, per person per acre than any time previously in the history of the United States. But every one of the directors of the national park that was interviewed said our budget has really been cut. How do I find the truth?
Well, I think that's makes the very point that concerns me. I read those Deseret News articles as well, and then I read the Bush website where the reporting shows the decline in budgets, operating budgets for the national parks, most of them. And the Bush website talks about how much funding has been increased and how the national parks have been able to renovate facilities and develop them. And I think it's an illustration, and I wish it were just one candidate doing it, but an illustration of a kind of willingness to make claims regardless of what the data say.
Any questions from the audience? Please.
Which candidate would aid developing new forms of energy the best and quickest?
Then could you repeat the question, please?
The question is which candidate would aid in the development of alternative energy forms? Both candidates are proposing development of alternative sources. President Bush talks about especially the development of hydrogen technologies, of supports for the development of wind technologies, and Kerry has long stood in favor of alternative sources. I guess the thing that interests me about both of them in this whole discourse coming off of this is how little they talk about the conservation alternative, and that both are mainly emphasizing developing more and more energy sources. That's not an answer to your question, because I don't think there is one.
As with other things, this has an economic foundation, as you know. I mean, the issue here for an economist is prices, and I think the argument is pretty compelling that the prices are wrong. And you know, we can have conservation programs and we can have incentives for alternative development, but the easiest solution here would be to have $8 a gallon gasoline. I was in Turkey this summer, and that's about what it costs in Turkey. People drive small cars. They live in urban areas. They take public transportation. So a large part of this, and they conserve. And the Turkish government doesn't have to tell people to conserve. It just charges $8 for a gallon of gasoline. So part of the issue here is that we want to buy gasoline at 50 cents a gallon, and then believe that we won't have sprawl, we won't have lots of big cars on the road, and we won't be importing lots of energy. And this is a simple price problem.
My concern about our thing, I think we're coming near the end of an hour, is we've made our candidates sound too much the same. There really are a lot of differences between these two candidates. On the immigration issue, President Bush is favoring workers and employers to keep the economic part of it going. Kerry is saying no. He's trying to say, yes, let's make a legal program, a nice program to come, but he's much more concerned about cutting off some of those illegals and not making economics the factor that run the thing. Sorry, Jim, but trying to say there have to be other factors. I think we do need to say there are real differences, but I don't think our experience here today has shown those at all.
Well, but there are good reasons why they're the same. I mean, there is the median voter theorem, which suggests that both parties should be the same, which means you don't really need to vote because it doesn't make much difference and it's irrational anyway.
That's a tough note to end on. One we will categorically say don't listen to. Please do vote. Recognize that it is a right of the American population, that is a right that lots of people strive for everywhere. Please do take the opportunity to vote. But most specifically, listen to the discussion here. Also, get up on the internet. Look at some of these debate transcripts. Look at some of the different websites that the various candidates have. Start participating on the various editorials and such that are written across the different debate issues, the different talking points. And be an informed voter. Don't just vote because you have the right to do so. Be one that's informed.